Hi, my name is Dr. Laegreid. I'm a professor of history at the University of Wyoming's History Department. And today I'm going to talk about Buffalo Bill in Italy. So I first heard of Buffalo Bill in Italy about 20 years ago when my husband and I took our kids to Italy to meet some of my relatives. I was still working on my PhD dissertation at the time, and one of my uncles asked what I was writing about. And I said, women in rodeo. And he said, Buffalo Bill was here in Italy and Italian cowboys beat American cowboys. And I was stunned because I hadn't heard anything about this before. And it took me a while, but I finally started doing some research on this. And what I found was fascinating. It wasn't just that Cody took his show to Italy, or that his cowboys beat Cody's cowboys, or so the Italians say, but how Cody's show informed and shaped Italians' view of America, how his long memory persisted in Italian memory, and how a bucking contest in Rome became a metaphor for how Italians critiqued and in some cases continue to critique America today. So Buffalo Bill Cody and his troupe arrived in Rome in February of 1890. It was part of an extended European tour. His first international trip occurred a few years earlier when he performed in London alongside the Queen's Jubilee. It was her 50th anniversary celebration. And then he took his performances across England. And the trip went really well. He met royalty, he gave a command performance for the Queen, and the number of people who flocked to his shows just made sure it was a huge financial success for him. So when Cody got back home, he quickly made plans for another more ambitious tour through Europe, one that included a return to England, and then on to Scotland, France, Spain, Italy, Belgium, Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Ukraine. Now, he arrived in Italy in January of 1890, the end of January, and began his tour in Naples, then moved upwards through the country. Now, just as Cody had coordinated his first trip in England with the important local events like the Queen's Jubilee, he did the same thing for this tour, tapping into crowds already destined for the cities that he planned to visit. So in Rome, he scheduled his shows to overlap with the annual anniversary of Pope Leo XIII's coronation. This way, he ensured the Eternal City would be filled with locals and visitors alike, and he was hoping that all these people would be eager for secular as well as sacred spectacle. For folks who study Buffalo Bill, his international tours are important. They demonstrate his use of modern technology for logistics. They delve into his personal correspondence, his advertising strategies, his colleagues, and all the connections that he made. But his tour is also important to understand how Cody was understood by the Italians. In 1890, the Italian population as a whole knew less about the United States than many other countries. Italy politically had been regionally oriented by nation state for centuries, and it had only become a country in 1861. So Italians had very little reason to invest any attention in the U.S. anyway. And then, too, the high illiteracy rate among non-elites meant that even if the local people, the population had heard of the United States, the overwhelming majority of Italians had very little factual knowledge of the history or its western regions. What they knew of America was based on a complex group of phrases of, quote, words, slogans, quotations, bits of remembered or imagined talk, unquote, from all sorts of sources. So when Cody and his Wild West troupe arrived in Italy, he helped bring these diverse images into a focus that centered on the American West. But because he was from the United States, by extension, Cody came to represent not just the West, but all of the United States. And this is where it gets interesting, because by reading Italian newspapers that covered Cody's tour, two distinct views emerge. The first is a very positive view, as Italians who had heard good things about the U.S. rushed to see the new world performing in the old. By the time Cody had arrived in Italy, nearly 160,000 Italians a year were leaving the country, and about half of that number was going to the United States. So letters home from immigrants had provided a peek into a world that beckoned with opportunity. And those who returned from the U.S. to their hometowns, which about half of all immigrants did, told stories of hard work, but also the possibility of work that offered a higher standard of living, if not wealth, and of enjoying a social status that was absolutely impossible to achieve in Italy's rigid social hierarchy. So while Cody meant to impress spectators with historical perspectives of Western history rather than inspire immigration, his own story of an impoverished rural worker who rose to wealth and fame reinforced the idea of America as a place of opportunity. His story appealed to the masses, showing that America, and especially the American West, was truly the promised land. Now, while the majority of Italians welcomed Cody, he and his show received a chillier reception from the nobility and the aristocracy. For the elites, it was not illiteracy that hindered their knowledge of the United States, but a lack of interest, if not outright contempt. In their view, America was an uncivilized and unimportant country politically. And worse, the American democratic system threatened their very social structure. Italian elites interacting with immigrants who had returned home reinforced their worst fears. So they saw the U.S. as increasing what they called a threat to established institutions, to the authority of the family, the church, the state, and above all, to the prevailing class structure of society. The experience of an Italian landowner captures their concern when he complained that, quote, men who come back from America walk through the streets as if there are equals, and the worst of it is, signore, they lose respect for us, unquote. So in my research, the newspapers covering Cody's tours have been incredibly valuable. The coverage was extensive with these diverse views of Cody just right before your very eyes. And looking through the reporting then, three basic themes centering on Cody seem to emerge. The first thing is absolute delight. News stories came out every day about Cody and his troupe. Readers could learn about Native American performers enjoying Italian coffee at a fancy coffee shop, or they could keep up on the news, what's Annie Oakley doing today? And with new technology of photography, they could see images along with these stories. So when Cody managed to secure an audience with the Pope for his Native American performers, which was just an unimaginable honor for the masses, the press went nuts with full-page pictures of Cody and his Native performers splashed across the front pages. The second theme was using Cody as a way for Romans to poke fun at themselves. This cartoon is really fun. It shows two very well-dressed women walking past a poster of Buffalo Bill, and one says to the other, "Oh, what a handsome man." And the other says, "Yes, and if you have one of those horned beasts that need training, he can do that and return him to you meek as a lamb." And then the first replies, "Really? I'll have to bring my husband to him." But on a more serious tone, journalists also use Cody to critique their own politics and politicians. And they were especially quick to pick up on the country's colonization efforts with Cody. The Italian Prime Minister Crispi had just begun a campaign to colonize Africa when Cody arrived. And the image of a rifle-toting, fringe-coated Cody served as a useful tool for politicians and intellectuals. His shows, which glorified America's expansion into the West and his role in that, became a timely metaphor for the Italians critical of Crispi's colonization plans. Now, the third theme is an outright disdain for Cody. Now, I have to say, this is much less common than the other two, but it is a reminder that not everyone welcomed him unconditionally. One reporter provided an unusually harsh critique when Cody's show first opened in Rome, complaining that the writers were second-rate, the show was repetitive, and the entire performance was a delusion, so don't waste your money on it. Others pointedly asked of Italians proud of their history, art, architecture, music, and literature, what did Buffalo Bill and his troupe, these barbarians in rough dress, have to offer? There is a "who do you think you are, you commoners, hanging with the aristocracy" tone that runs through these comments, calling Cody out for his pretentious behavior and chiding their countrymen and countrymen and countrywomen for not only fawning over him, but for enduring the cold and rain to watch his shows. Maybe the critiques of Cody would have faded away after a bit, but an event happened. One of those historical moments that crystallized criticism of Cody into Italian memory. And that event was a bucking contest. Actually, it was a series of bucking contests, but the last one, known as La Sfida, is one that the Italians remember, the one that my uncle told me about over 100 years after it had happened. So La Sfida began as a single bet between Cody and the Duke of Serramonte, who had a large estate south of Rome. The original bet centered on the question of whether or not Cody's Native American performers could ride the Duke's wild, untamed colts. So Cody's shows often featured these contests. It was a way to generate interest and free advertising in his shows, and Cody never made a bet he didn't think he couldn't win. Plus, the competition was scheduled to take place during his show, so that meant increased publicity and bringing in more paying spectators. The newspapers excitedly reported that Cody and the Duke had arranged the contest. The terms were very simple. The Duke would supply wild colts. If Cody's performers could catch, saddle, mount, and ride the colts to a standstill, then Cody would win the bet and the horses. If his riders failed, he promised to give 10,000 lire to the poor. Now, as Cody expected, his riders did really well, impressing the crowds and winning those two beautiful Maremma colts for Cody. Almost immediately after the contest, another sprang up. This time the bet was whether or not Cody's cowboys could ride the Duke's wild colts. Newspaper critiques now shifted to a comparison between Cody's cowboys, the American cowboys, and Italian buteri. And buteri are Italian cowboys. And this initiated a form of cultural competition connecting the two cattle herders with attributes of their country and foreshadowing attitudes that remain after the bucking contest. Now, Italian cowboys, or buteri, have tended cattle in the marshes of western Italy since before the ancient Romans. As agricultural workers, they were part of the traditional social structure, very low on the overall hierarchy, but they were pretty high up in status on large ranches because of their ability to train horses and work with the cattle. Cody's cowboys succeeded in bucking out the colts, but not without controversy. Newspaper coverage focused on how the cowboys did this, focusing on how they lassoed the horses' feet and threw them to the ground, then blindfolded the horses, shoving a bit into their mouths, getting a saddle on their back, then cutting the ropes as the cowboys jumped into the saddle. Now, the spectators were just going nuts. They were cheering wildly for Cody's riders, but the reporters were more critical. They considered this method of handling the horses barbaric. And while admitting that Cody's cowboys showed admirable speed and skill, they devoted more coverage to what they considered was a brutal treatment of the horses, which they saw as a character flaw in the Americans. Journalists also noticed how the buteri who watched the performance were also disgusted with the Americans' treatment of the colts. So this leads to the third and final contest, Italian buteri attempting to ride the Duke's wild colts. This is the contest that did not go smoothly. Now, according to the Italian newspapers, and I'll read the quote here, 8 buteri from the Roman countryside presented themselves at Buffalo Bill's arena, bringing with them wild colts. They saddled and mounted 2 without the same aids used by the cowboys, which was, of course, lassoing feet and using blindfolds. They were ready to take the 3rd colt to the party when Mr. Buffalo Bill intervened, saying that the contest was over. Now, this brief description illustrates the 2 points of contention that continued to surface: the Americans' handling of the colts and a confusion over the time limit. A new battle now begins immediately between the United States and Italian newspapers over the true victors of the competition. The American papers insisted that Cody's riders won, saying the time limit had been clearly stated and that the Italian presses, quote, for reasons best not inquired into, had been from the first inimical to Cody, writing things both libelous and scurrilous, unquote. So, for a brief moment, Cody's cowboys were lauded as American heroes in U.S. papers. Now, according to the Italian newspapers, Buteri won. They argued Cody had never mentioned a time limit before the start of the contest, and therefore his arbitrary demand to stop was a sham, and, quote, victory remains to the Buteri, always and for the ages, unquote. The Italian presses described Cody as a buffoon, a cheat, and a swindler who ran away without paying his debt of honor. And they valorized the Buteri as the real cowboys, upholding centuries of tradition, while dismissing Cody's cowboys as pretend cowboys and not the real thing, constructed by Cody just to perform in his shows. Critics used the competition to vent their anger at Cody's arrogance, which they saw as an extension of American arrogance, making this both a political and a cultural issue. In a contest between New and Old World cowboys, each side declared victory. The Americans claimed their victory proved the superiority of New World youthfulness, skill, brute strength. The Italians argued they won, proving the superiority of their Italian Old World traditions. Now, while Americans forgot this contest almost immediately, Italians didn't. At least, not among some of the elites, intellectuals, and politicians. For over a century, this contest with Buffalo Bill, at the center of controversy, continued to resurface in various forms: poetry, literature, social and political discourse and commentary. And it still serves as a familiar venue for Italians to show their pride in their country and their traditions, and occasionally to critique American culture and policies. That the Italians still remember this event is a reminder of how something that might seem inconsequential to the United States can strike a chord in another country long after the event itself. How a showman can come to be seen not only as a representative of the American West, but as a metaphor for all of the United States itself. So, if you decide to come to the University of Wyoming, I hope you will become interested in learning more about the American West through courses here at the university's history department, and also through many of the wonderful resources we have on campus.